For countless generations, mankind languished in darkness. Having been driven away from the light of paradise, he suffered under the darkness and oppression of the devils. This was the state of man when the light broke forth once again into the world, laying bare the works of the enemy and once again illuminating the hearts of men with that glorious hope. This is, of course, a central part of the Christian story, and what we have just celebrate with the season of Christmas, the celebration of Christ's nativity. Though some may think that the birth of Christ is wondrous due only to the fact that it points towards his death on the cross, this overlooks a central and crucially important aspect of Christ's victory over the forces of darkness, or over the darkness itself. Christ came to free us from sin and to deliver us from demonic slavery. And his revelation at his birth and the revelation of his divinity at the theophany that we celebrated as Orthodox Christians today, or the epiphany that Western Christians celebrated today, was the first great victory in this war. This was something that forever changed the world and signaled the ultimate downfall of our ancient enemy. It was in a very real way the light breaking forth in the darkness and driving out the forces of darkness. So tonight on this Feast of Theophany, I want to look at some ancient customs surrounding the time of year that today's feast really signals the close of, and that is Christmastide. And what these show us about Christ's victory over the forces of evil and how it is that we are more than just passive observers in this cosmic story that is unfolding before us, but active participants. So join me tonight as we encounter the ghosts, the wild spirits, the demons, but also the light, the joy, and the victory of Christmastide. Good evening, everybody, and welcome once again to The Sacred Life. As always, I am your host, David Baylor. I'm excited about this episode tonight to look at some of the, I guess you would say, some of the legends, some of the stories, the folk customs, and things like that surrounding Christmas. And I'm looking in particular tonight at legends from the Swiss Alps because that's my own heritage. It's something I kind of focus on a little bit in terms of like looking at folk customs and legends, because I think it's useful to focus on one thing in particular, and this is one thing in particular. I mean, I'm more connected to, I know more about. But there's the same patterns that are at work in here are kind of at work in Christendom more broadly. And I think there's a lot that this kind of reveals to us about sort of the pattern in the way that Christians traditionally have encountered, I guess, the meaning of our own religion. And I think if we really closely examine these things, we get to understand a lot about ourselves and a lot about the world that we inhabit. And so that's kind of what I hope to accomplish tonight. I want to remind everybody once again, please consider checking out the link in the description, especially for our sponsor, Gregorius Iconography, which is, of course, me. I am an iconographer in the Orthodox Church. You can check out my new store. And if you're watching this in video on demand, I'll also have some products linked under the video here. I didn't get that set up. I forgot to do that before I went live here tonight. But you can check that out. That's a great way to support what we're doing here at The Sacred Life. If you would be interested in purchasing a hand-painted icon or a custom commission or things like that, I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, you can also consider joining us as channel members, supporting us with super chats, things like that. We appreciate all of you, even if you just watch. If you're not subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you subscribe, and definitely be sure to click the like and share on this video. Help us to continue to grow our channel. And once again, thanks everybody who has been with us so far. The growth that we've seen over the past year or so, we appreciate all of you, and excited to move forward. So anyway, let's enough of that. Let's get back into the topic of the video. So deep in the snow-covered peaks of the Swiss Alps, where in winter the snow holds the land and its people in its icy grip, and where even to this day the power of nature continues to impose its will on the lives of the people, a series of fascinating customs have developed and emerged over the ages. While more cynical modern scholars holding to, well, frankly, silly ideas like Christmas being derived from pagan festivals such as Saturnalia and things like that, they might see these things merely as being remnants or echoes of ancient paganism. maybe like fractured elements of a world long since forgotten and preserved only through these, these wild and often frightening customs that emerged during the darkest, coldest, and indeed, in many ways, the most enchanted time of the year. But just like we know that these dismissive ideas about the dating of Christmas are not really grounded in fact or in historical reality. So, I mean, Christmas is dated from the Feast of the Annunciation, for example, and has nothing, like the dating of Christmas has nothing to do with these other pagan holidays. And so we also understand that these things, these customs that we're talking about tonight, are in fact entirely and uniquely Christian. Um, and even Christians with like a more sort of like fundamentalist or puritanical sense of things might mistakenly try to dismiss these things because, they're uncomfortable, they don't fit within the system that they've constructed. The dark and frightening symbolism associated with them, um, it's frightening to them, it's strange to them, it's bizarre to them. It goes against the sensibilities they've developed. There's an incongruity with their theological notions, like the theological notions of especially like the Reformed branch of the Christian tradition. But what there is of paganism echoed in these practices, it's not really some kind of accident. It's not like some hidden pagan thing snuck through, managed to be smuggled into the modern world somehow. Or it's not like some kind of latent memory of paganism that somehow survived lurking below the surface or resisting being stamped out by Christianity and by the church. And neither is it some kind of evidence of a people and of a culture that's not like properly catechized, not properly converted and brought into the Christian era, or brought over to the Christian religion. No, rather, these things are powerful manifestations of the Christian story, rooted in the intentional incorporation of ancient symbols, which is what the church always does, what Christianity always does. And Christianity has injected these things with Christ to fill them with new meaning and recapitulate them. As we see, for example, articulated by church fathers like Saint Irenaeus, um, or Saint Athanasius and his teachings on the incarnation, where God assumes human nature to deify and redeem all creation, transforming even echoes of the old order into vessels of divine truth. And in particular, they reveal how the miracle that is the gospel broke forth into the lives of these people amid the cosmic struggle of light over darkness, exposing the demonic powers when they were at their height. And this is symbolized by winter's lifelessness and the often frightful and terrifying imagery central to a lot of the practices that we're going to be discussing tonight. And then ultimately only to overthrow them through the incarnate word's triumph over sin and death. So these customs show us something important about the fundamental character of the Christian faith, its participatory and liturgical essence, where we are called not to passively receive salvation, but to actively enter the eternal divine drama, bearing light and wielding spiritual weapons against raging opposition as seen in personal spiritual warfare and about ourselves. So, to understand the world of Christmastide, we have to first understand a fundamental quality of the world as the ancients understood it, not as divided into distinct and separate material and spiritual worlds that are somehow separate, somehow apart from each other, distinct or relatively isolated places, like one over here, here's the material, one over here, here's the spiritual. But rather as one world, which, to borrow a bit from the terminology of Tolkien, consists of elements that are seen and unseen. So that is, we live in a world that's populated not only by those people, those creatures, those things that we can see and hear and encounter and touch with our rational senses of our bodies, but one that is also inhabited by, influenced by, and in many ways is subject to unseen powers that we might variously refer to in our various traditions as spirits, or even as things like ghosts, or as angels, demons, and even gods. But there is something like a veil separating the unseen from our perception. If you think of a veil as something that covers and that hides and that obscures things. You don't necessarily have to think of a veil as a boundary, but it is also kind of that at the same time. I hope that's not too confusing what I'm trying to say there. Of course, veils are also a very important symbol in the Bible, and in Christian tradition, and also in ancient myth and folklore. And we're going to see. Hopefully, I'll break down that veil symbolism a little bit more tonight, and it'll make a bit more sense as we go along. And once again, remind everybody, I do have a presentation, and if you're tuning in tonight and you have some questions, go ahead and leave those in the live chat, and I'll get to those later on. But I'm going to go ahead and go through with the presentation, then we'll get to that later on. So starting with the theme of veils, we have to begin really with the Advent season when we're talking about these customs of Christmastide. So the time that's leading up to Christmas, and this is the time where you could say we think of the incarnate Christ, who you can say comes into his creation at his conception, that is at the Annunciation. During this time, he is veiled. He is hidden from the world. He's unseen, unknown, not yet revealed, but covered and concealed in the Virgin's womb. So in local customs, this is reflected with things like what we have in the Swiss Alps, the Rabelichtli, which are turnip lanterns, really is what they are. Children carve designs into turnips and place candles in them, and then they gather together in this parade in the village at night, singing. There's a traditional song they sing. I'll actually go ahead and quote the line of the song. I'm not going to try to sing it, but I'll quote the line of the song in the local dialect. It's Rabelichtli, Rabelichtli vogashi, in de donkle nacht on ich stanishi, dom muss mis lichtli si. Which means, well, Rabelichtli is the turnip lantern. Turnip lantern, turnip lantern, turnip lantern, turnip lantern, where are you going? In the dark night without the shine of stars, that's where I must go. That's kind of a loose translation. I'm kind of translating it on the fly here. And you can see kind of symbolically at this time, you see, you kind of have this symbolism of the light, but the light is concealed and hidden inside of a lantern. It's not like carried out in the open. It's hidden inside of a turnip, I guess you could say. And even think about what a turnip is. A turnip is like something that grows in the ground. And you pull it out, but you can sort of see the symbolism there of a turnip as something that is hidden, something that is concealed, only to be brought forth. And then you see the star, or the light, of course, being hidden inside the turnip, which is kind of symbolically relating to this idea of the light of Christ at this time of Advent, being concealed, being hidden away. And of course, there is kind of this relationship suggested in the song that is associated with this custom with the light of the star, and it's the light of the stars is also suggested to not be present in this darkness, which is kind of pointing at this idea of the time of the advent of Christ as being a time of darkness, a time when darkness was at its height. And this really points at like this profound hidden truth that's very, very fitting for the Advent season. So it's into our darkness in the dark night in Bethlehem, where the light that was hidden from the world shone forth, that is Christ. So here, so beautifully represented by the light hidden in the lantern. And just a few other things. There's some other local customs associated with the Advent season that are kind of loosely connected with this as well. You see things like like a particular custom I was thinking about was they have customs of like observing the weather during these 12 days of Advent, and there's a way in which you can observe the weather and observe the signs, and like according to the local custom, they think this this points towards the weather that's going to be in the coming months of the months of the coming year. And I'm not quite sure how to unpack that, but I know there's a connection there between like looking at that at what is concealed, what is hidden in in the weather at this time, and what does that reveal to you about what's to come. But it is on the night of Christmas Eve in particular that the rending of the veils becomes evident. Understanding, of course, that liturgically the night of Christmas Eve is in fact the beginning of the Feast of Nativity. So on that night, Christmas Eve night is really the beginning of Christmas. Um, and so this is really the decisive day when heaven broke through and invaded the earth. And this is the day when the divine light shone upon our darkness, and when that life-sustaining light drove back our ancient foe. The Logos enters the world, piercing through the veil symbolized by his birth in the cave. So it really is profoundly fitting that it is at the height of winter, when the darkness is at its height, that this takes place. So St. Athanasius speaks of this event in truly profound ways. And if you haven't read his writing, his book on the Incarnation, really go and read that. I highly recommend that to everybody. I've read it multiple times myself and hope to read it multiple times in the future. It's just an excellent work. And especially like in terms of understanding a lot of the things that we're discussing on this channel, a lot of things that we're discussing tonight, and understanding how incarnational theology is so central to Christianity. This is just an excellent work. And he speaks of things like the oracles falling silent, the power of the magicians and the sorcerers failing, the dominion of the demons falling. And this is all because Christ, God incarnate, broke through and overthrew the power of the demons. And this profound element of incarnational theology is really amazingly illustrated in these ancient Alpine customs. And again, we're going to get into more detail on these customs. I'm just trying to lay the backdrop to help us understand all these things right now. So, of course, being exposed by the light, what does this do? This causes the demons to kind of fall into this sort of rage. And for this reason, the nights of Christmastide in the Alps, and really in a lot of German-speaking regions, are called I'll just go ahead and give the High German version of the word right now, the Rauhnächte, or the rough nights. And this is when their demonic nature is on full display. So you might really be struck by this if you observe a lot of these customs. And you see, if you see the thumbnail, for example, you saw a picture of one of them. You see these figures dressed up, frankly, as demonic beings. And they are dressed up as demonic beings, as these very terrifying and rough things. And you might wonder, like, what is going on here, and what does this have to do with Christmas? And this, of course, we're getting into that now. They're pointing to something very important here, to what really is going on. What's really going on with the incarnation of Christ, and like this cosmic battle that is unfolding with the incarnation of God, and this cosmic battle that is really, really central to the Christian story. And that I want you to understand, like, that really is what is being signaled by these things. And again, as much as they have kind of borrowed or preserved ancient pagan images and so forth, it is for this reason that they've done that. It's not an accident. It's not something that snuck through. So again, this is when the nature of these demonic powers is on full display, when they're raging and lashing out with all of their terror, because they've been exposed, and because they recognize that their defeat is at hand. And of course, we really all understand the reality of this in our own lives, because it is precisely when we draw closer to God, or when we are progressing in the spiritual path, when we are growing in holiness by the grace of God, that we begin to see, when we begin to see the light of his grace shining in our lives, that we really encounter this very same phenomenon. We encounter the demons raging against us, raging against their defeat, really showing their ugliness. So that's one thing, that's one thing that is profound to me about the juxtaposition of these terrifying images with like the wonder and the beauty and the glory of the Christmas season is because it's so true. It's so deeply and profoundly true that this is so much how our own experience is. Like when God enters into my night, when God enters into my world, that's when these dark things in my own world and in my own life and in my own self are exposed and really rage and show their ugliness. And so it is, yeah, it is profoundly fitting and appropriate that these things, that these sort of things go on at this time of year. Um, and of course, this also represents the recapitulation of mankind and all of creation. Christ entering into our humanity restores our humanity, and Christ entering into creation drives out the pollution and restores it bit by bit. And again, as Orthodox Christians, of course, today we have the Feast of Theophany, and last night we had the yeah, at my parish anyway, we had the Theophany Vespers last night and the blessing of the waters, because again, last night is liturgically the day of Theophany. And this incarnational theology is so central to that, and this sort of symbolism that I'm discussing tonight with these Christmastide festivals, these Christmastide traditions, really points to this incarnational theology as well. And of course, what's happening for us as Orthodox Christians with Theophany is Christ entering into the waters and sanctifying them and making them holy. And that's of course is what's going on with Christ's incarnation as well. Like I said, Christ entering into our humanity restores our humanity, recapitulates it, again to use that term from Saint Irenaeus. And of course, we also see powerful images associated with the Christmastide season and local customs that really point to the breaking down of the barriers that normally separate things, normally keep things apart. So, for example, there's a local custom in the Alps, one that actually, interestingly enough, has been preserved at least to some degree among the Old Order Amish in North America, which is that if you go into your barn at midnight, midnight on Christmas Eve. So, like, midnight, just think about this. First of all, midnight is kind of like this liminal space, is like it is not really one day or the other. Um, but you go into the barn at midnight, and you will hear, according to the legends, the animals speaking in words that you can understand, speaking in human language. Now, there's different customs as to what, and different versions of the story as to what you hear them say. Sometimes they are glorifying Christ and his incarnation, and sometimes they're basically gossiping. They're like telling the secrets of their owners, or the bad things that their owners have done to them, or things like that, or the gossip, the rumors and the stuff that they've overheard, because they're the animals in the stall and they hear all the secrets. um so, like, if you look at this, on the one hand, you see something like the animals glorifying, praising the incarnation of Christ, and this is something kind of like the material world. This kind of symbolizes, this points to something like the material world being elevated to the divine worship. And to me, this evokes images of things like the donkey and the ox that we usually see, like in traditional manger scenes or in the nativity icon. And then it also, for me at least, calls to mind the aspect of the anaphora of the divine liturgy, which is where we find ourselves elevated from our material sense to like these angelic heights, and joining into the divine worship of God in heaven, the divine worship of the saints and angels. And then, of course, like I said, you also have them like expressing their grievances, the animals expressing their grievances, telling the secrets that they've heard from their human masters, and so on. Which, in contrast to that, also relates to this idea at Christmastide of things being laid bare by the divine light shining on them. This is this time when even those things that you thought were hidden and were secret and safe, they really aren't so hidden. Um, And of course, a central element that emerges, um, a central element is, of course, the importance of light. So, even in America, of course, we know that you have traditionally you have Christmas trees and you put lights on Christmas trees. In this region, in the Alps, of course, they traditionally don't put electric lights on their trees. They put actual candles on their Christmas trees, and in some regions and in some households, they might even have candles that have been passed down through generations of their families. In some cases, they're centuries old candles that are used only on Christmas. Um, and of course, we know that light is just such a central element to Christmas celebrations. And of course, I talked about that in a previous video with some of the symbolism of Christmas and the importance, the centrality of light. And of course, relating to that, what we're talking about tonight with the Christmas so much being the light of God, the light of God's grace and his glory and his salvation breaking forth into the darkness. And keep that in mind as we go forward, and just that kind of juxtaposition of the light and some of the imagery that we're going to see. And then of course what you also see, is things like the burning of herbs and incense in homes and barns, prayers with holy water, things like that. That kind of, on the one hand, bring to mind the gifts of the Magi. Also, relate that somewhat to the Eastern custom. Again, I'm an Orthodox Christian, and we just today is the Feast of Theophany, where we celebrate the blessing of the waters, and of course, we'll use that water to bless the church, to bless our homes, bless many things. Um, and I think I already kind of covered the symbolism of that, so I don't need to go over that again. But we're moving forward now from this Advent tide, and then from Christmas Day into Christmas tide, into the what you might say are the 12 days of Christmas. And again, I mentioned that they, in local custom, refer to specifically the night part of these 12 days as the Rauhnächte, the rough nights, again, is how you might translate that. And really, what you see going on during these nights, during these 12 nights, and again, you saw this already established with the kind of the strange liminal things going on the night of Christmas Eve. Um, but then you see this going forward into the 12 nights of Christmas, from the night of December 24th through the night of January 5th. This same kind of symbolism only becomes much more overt in the coming nights. So again, you go forward with the things like the burning of incense and the blessings and things like that. Um, there's a lot I could go over there, but I want to focus on something else more particularly. Um, so instead, I'm gonna look more at, I guess what you might say are the more overtly demonic symbolism. And of course, we look at the title of this stream, of this video tonight, how these terrifying Christmas customs point to Christ's triumph over demons. So now I think it's definitely high time we actually get to these terrifying customs. So, for example, you have things like what are called the Perchtenlaufe or Perchtenläufe. Um, Perchte, or sometimes Berchtold, is, how do you describe this figure? It's an interesting character. I saw we had a question in the comment. What about Odin, Freya, Loki, and Thor? Well, for one thing, those are Scandinavian gods, and we're not talking about Scandinavia. We're talking about Central Europe and the Alps in this stream tonight. Now, of course, if you want to get into like Yuletide customs in the north, there's definitely a lot to talk about with those characters. But since we're talking about Perchte here, or Berchtold, um, there's some overlap between Perchte and Odin, but of course, one difference being that Perchte is oftentimes depicted as female, and Odin often is obviously male. But one thing that they have in common in this time of year, in this kind of this Christmas tide, Yule tide, whatever you want to call it, situation or time period, is that they are both seen as leaders of the wild hunt. Excuse me, I need to get a drink. And so you have again the Perchtenläufe, which are these processions. And there's kind of an interesting contrast going on with what they'd call the Schöpechte and the Schierpechte, which would be like the beautiful and the ugly, or the beautiful or the fearsome. So these would be masked figures that are parading around. You'll see this particularly in regions like Appenzell in eastern Switzerland, and also across the border into Austria. Mass groups that parade around, doing things like cracking whips, ringing bells, carrying torches in village parades, making all kinds of noise. And then you see other things. This is pretty much universal across the Swiss Alps, of these parades of bell ringers. They might call it Trichung. There's a number of local parades, local festivals. I think of things like the Übersitz in the eastern part of the Bernese Oberland as a very good example of this. And these groups parade around with these very large cowbells and processions, making all kinds of noises. And you'll also see things like during this time, families will set like an extra spot at their tables for basically like for their departed ancestors and things like that. And so I don't know, there's just so much of this. Like I already mentioned the wild hunt, these spectral processions, again led by Berchtold or Perchta, as something that's going on during this Rauhnächte period. There's all these figures in these parades all over these villages, dressed as these frightening like nature spirits or demonic spirits. And there's a number of ways that people look at these things. They might try to look at them again, like to say like, oh, these are obviously just pagan customs that the Christians never managed to get rid of. But again, I don't think that's a great way to look at them. One thing I've heard, I've heard this from a lot of modern, like a lot of modern examinations of these things, a lot of like modern scholarship trying to look at these things and figure out what they are, and what's going on, and say that like, these represent like pagan customs to ward off the evil spirits. And I think like there is, how should I say this? Like there's a certain way that that's right, and there's a lot of ways that that's wrong. And rather than say it's simply like this is a remnant of a pagan custom to, we have to do this to ward off the evil spirits so they don't bring calamity on us. I think a better way to look at it is like, no, this is actually something like a participation and a recapitulation and a representation of this divine drama that is unfolding with the Christmas tide. And one thing that's really, really important is this distinction that exists between how ancient and medieval Christians understood how the Christian story unfolds and what our place is in it and how we participate in it, and how modern Christians, and especially like Reformed Protestants, and more puritanical, especially Protestants, perceive of these things. And on the one hand, you might see Christians as like passive partakers of the grace, partakers in the grace of God. He's like, Jesus died on the cross, and believe in him and you will be saved, and things like that. But in contrast to that, how I was an Orthodox Christian, or how any Christian in the Middle Ages, any Christian in the ancient world would have looked at it is like, no, this is this is something that we are participating in. And it's not that we are like passive observers or passive recipients of these things, but rather we actively participate. We enter into this divine drama. And what I want to point out with these customs, with these things that are happening at Christmas tide, is not that these are simply I should say, pagan customs that have somehow been preserved, but rather that they're really illustrations of the divine drama, again, that is unfolding. And just in the same way that our perspective as Orthodox Christians is that when we are in the divine liturgy, and when we are undergoing the liturgical life of the church, when we are participating in the liturgical cycle and all of these things, that we are really participating in, I guess you could call it, the divine drama that is unfolding. We're participating in the divine story. And what is happening with these Christmastide celebrations is that very thing. It's like an extension of this liturgical understanding of the world. It's an extension of this sacramental understanding of the world. That it's kind of like this. It's kind of like this divine drama unfolding, like I've said. That they are like, how should I say this? Sorry, I'm getting slightly distracted by the comments over here. Most of them have nothing to do with nothing really to do with what we're talking about. Well, I mean, they do, but they're just, yeah. Anyway, I'll deal with that later. I'm not ignoring you guys. I will address some of your comments and questions here in a bit. But for now, I need to just not be distracted by those things. So I'm going to click off the comments tab. Sorry about that. Anyway, so my fundamental thesis in this episode tonight, that I'm trying to present to you, is that what we see in these customs as they unfold really is this deeply profound illustration of the Christian story. And what we see in particular is an expression, I mean, in this case, it is a local expression, but it's the same story expressed through this particular local idiom. But we see virtually the same symbolism everywhere we look in the Christian world, where some kind of older version of the Christian way of life has survived. I think in a lot of cases, modernity has tried to stamp these things out. And Protestantism in particular has tried to stamp these things out because they view them as pagan superstition or demonic or something like that. And what I'm saying rather is the proper way to look at these things is to understand that they are revealing to us the fundamental character of how the gospel unfolds. So, of course, there is this juxtaposition between the daytime of Christmastide, which is this time of wonder and of joy and of celebration, and the nighttime of Christmastide, which again in the local custom is the rough nights, the Rauhnächte, when these demonic forces are on display. And the rather than seeing it simply as this kind of superstitious act, which again, like, I think it's dumb to dismiss paganism as silly superstition. And it's even dumber to dismiss these Christian customs as silly pagan superstition. Those are both wrong ways of thinking that don't really capture the reality of the world that we live in. Instead, again, what's going on is this really wonderful and remarkable display of how the Christian story unfolds. That, again, what I was getting to, we have the difference between the day and the night, and the day being this time of wonder and of joy and of celebration and of giving of gifts and of feasting and of all these things. As Orthodox Christians, for example, we have the Nativity fast for 40 days leading up to the celebration of the Nativity, leading up to Christmas. And then the 12 days of Christmas are a time of feasting, where there are no fasts during that time. I mean, except for yesterday. the fast before the celebration of Theophany. But other than that, we generally forego the Wednesday and Friday fast that we would normally have, because this is a time of joy and of celebration. But then again, in these local customs, you see at night, where because the light of Christ has shone forth into the world, the true nature of these demonic forces, the true nature of these demonic powers has been exposed. So now you see that put on display. They can't conceal what they are anymore. And again, rather than being this superstitious notion that we have to parade around and make all kinds of noise and do all this blessing with incense and smudging with the ashes and things like that in order to scare off the evil spirits and ward them off, or we have to set these tables for the spirits of the dead. We have to do these things. Like I should mention that like the spirits of the dead is also a central element that's pretty important in a lot of these local customs as well. And you'll see elements in the stories and in the legends and in the celebrations, the processions, and so on, that part of what's going on is what do you do about the spirits of the dead? What do you do about those who have died in the previous year? What do you do about the calamity, the misfortune, and all the bad things that have happened during the previous year? And if you want to be like a cynical modernist or like a puritanical fundamentalist Protestant, you can look at these customs and say, well, this is a superstitious pagan way of dealing with things. But there's a Christian way of understanding with these things, which is to recognize that what they are telling us is that it is the participation and the entering into and the extension of the sacramental life of the church. Um, and like that's the proper way that we deal with these things. I think one of the great misfortunes and tragedies of the modern world is that we think we can just ignore all of these things. Um, but of course, that's not real. And what I really appreciate about these customs, and I've really come to love about these customs, is especially in studying for this episode and putting together my outline and all that, and trying to dig up some of these things and put them all together. It's just to understand how this juxtaposition of the light and the darkness, that it's ultimately the light that dispels these things, the light that drives the evil away. And of course, we understand that the light that is so central symbolically in this Christmas time is Christ. And it is Christ that, of course, that drives off these demonic powers. It is Christ that is the victory over these things, and that really is what is going on with all of these things. And again, like I just want to say, it's silliness for Christians to look at this and say, oh, they have people dressed up as demonic figures, and they have people dressed up as scary bushmen and as all these wild nature spirits and all these things. And so that's pagan and it's superstition, and we have to get rid of that. We have to purify ourselves of that. It's like, no, we don't. And instead, what Christianity should do is to show us what the proper order and the proper place for these things is. And that's something, again, that I appreciate about these things. And if you saw some of the previous episodes that I've done about Christmas tide, and then I have another episode that I'd like to do diving into this more in detail, is that one thing that we really see with a lot of these customs, a lot of these festivals, a lot of these ancient stories, is that Christianity shows us what to do about all of these wild and untamed spirits that might bring misfortune or calamity upon us if we don't relate to them properly. And of course, we understand how to relate to them properly within the Christian story. And so that's really what I wanted to bring out tonight. Um, just to kind of recapitulate, to represent, and to tie together kind of all the different things that I was saying, that we see we see like kind of like the first level of the symbolism unfolding with Christmastide is this rending of the veils, and this breaking in of the light into the darkness. And of course, I mentioned like the rending of the veils at part in part symbolizing, Christ's concealment in the womb of the Virgin, and of course, then he's revealed in his birth. And then he's also revealed again in his epiphany and his theophany. So that's like the first level of the symbolism, that is like both the beginning and end of Christmastide. And when the veil is lifted or rent, or however you want to say it, when the light penetrates in and pierces the darkness, then we see two things happening. And these are the two things that I'm pointing on that are going on with this Christmas season, is that we have the wonder and the joy and the glory of the light, but then we also have the strangeness and the terror and all of that, of those things that the light exposes. And of course, then we understand that at Christ's epiphany, at theophany, that this is the close of these rough nights, when those things are kind of sealed away. Those things are driven out, and this is the end of these processions. This is the end of all of these things. So like it's fitting that it's bookended on both end by a revelation of Christ's divinity with his birth, and then with his theophany. And then we see with these rough nights, and with all this demonic imagery and all this stuff going on, the necessity of our participation in the divine drama, our participation in the divine story, and not like our passive observance of it. Because there is kind of this lesson that's being driven forward, that's being driven into our minds in all of these customs, something that was so instrumental, so central to the medieval and to the ancient understanding of the Christian faith, which is that if you don't participate, if you don't enter into the divine procession, which again is kind of like what is I don't know, it's sort of what's signified by the processions that are going on in these rough nights. But it's interesting because like you have the procession of these masked figures, and these figures making all the noise. But these processions traditionally are will always end at the church. I don't know. There's a lot of there's a lot to unpack there, but there's something there, sort of like even these things are being brought into the divine procession. And the church obviously is the telos of all of these things. It's where where this is all leading us, where these things are all brought into their proper unity, into their proper place, into their proper order. And so what we see with this is that, well, for one thing, again, it is the by our entering into and our participation in the liturgical life of the church, and ultimately in the light of Christ, that things are brought into their proper order. And there's also kind of this warning element along with that. And I think this is what a lot of people tend to misunderstand, and people tend to focus on this element too much and miscast what is going on with all these things, because there is like this idea that if you don't do these things, if you don't participate in these festivals, or if we don't do things the right way, then these spirits, these wild nature spirits, or these demonic spirits, or even like the spirits of the dead, or the spirits of misfortune or calamity, or whatever they might be, they might come back and terrorize us. And like you might look at it like, oh, it's our bell ringing, and it's our wearing of scary mask and making noises and shaking out the incense. That's like some kind of ward or magic action that's warding off these evil spirits. But I don't think that's the proper way to understand it, because of the liturgical context that these things exist within. Instead, I think this is a way that, if it's understood within that liturgical concept, you realize that liturgical context, you realize what they're saying is, and what they're teaching us through these things is that when we neglect these things, when we neglect the sacraments, when we neglect the church, when we neglect the cross, when we don't enter into the liturgical life of the church, when we neglect our prayers, when we don't partake of the Eucharist, when we don't do all of these things, then we really do leave ourselves exposed and vulnerable to these things. And I think that is something that is so wonderfully illustrated by these things. Anyway, that's all I have. That's all I have for this. I'm going to look through your comments quickly and see. I'll give a little bit of time for back and forth for question and answers. First of all, Martin Banks, you asked what are my thoughts on the Orthodox and the Catholic uniting. I've talked about that previously. You can see I did a video on ecumenism a while back. I don't know how good I actually got my point across, but what I was trying to point out is that a view of church unity that is common, especially among Protestants today, and increasingly popular among a lot of Catholics, a lot of Roman Catholics, I should say. It's just something that is not, I don't know, it's not something that has any, I don't know, any sway with the Orthodox. Like I don't see it as something that is going to happen, but I pray for, like, I pray for unity. But that said, I also think, there is only one church. The church is not divided. And either you are in it or you are not. And I guess you can take that and do with it as you will. Guinea Pig Man, you have a lot of comments going on here. I'll address some of it, but first I'll address this first one, which is, why are pagan customs bad? And that's actually a good question. And the answer is, depending on what you mean by a pagan custom and what sort of custom you're talking about, they are not necessarily bad in and of themselves. And that is something, there's like a puritanical crusade on the part of a lot of Christians, which is like anything that looks pagan or smells pagan, or, you might connect to paganism through some convoluted series of events, then we have to get rid of it because that's just, demonic, evil, and bad. But that's like almost like a Gnostic way of encountering the world. And as Christians, we don't have to think that way, and we don't have to fear something just because it's somehow connected to paganism. That Christians are able to recognize truth and goodness wherever it's found and to claim it, because truth, Christ is truth. Truth is a person, not like a rational proposition. Yeah, and Christopher Bradford kind of said that already. He said pagan customs are not bad. And so that's kind of my answer to that. Now, if by pagan customs he means sacrifices to demons, yeah, that's bad. We should not be doing that, because the demons, they're not your friends, and they don't have your best interest in mind, and they're just going to play along with you until they can do what they want. Like, the best way to think of it is, you're making a sacrifice to feed the demon, but really what they're devouring is you. You're actually the sacrifice. Christopher Bradford, you said Christians shut down pagan customs, pagans are heathens. And again, that depends on what you mean by pagan customs. In terms of sacrifices to demons, those sorts of practices, yes, Christians did shut them down. There are certainly other things that Christians were able to take and say, there's goodness in this and we can redeem it for Christ. and that's something that happens, and it's a legitimate thing. Um, um, Somebody commented that I look like a Holocaust survivor's last poop. That's a creative comment. Okay, now there's a lot of other comments here. So as I said, guinea pig man, you have a lot of comments going on here. So first of all, you said, I think you were talking about these festivals that I was talking about. You said those festivals are praying to other gods. Um, I'm not certain you know what you're talking about, just to put it frankly. Because then later on you said pagan festivals are done out of fun to enjoy life and nature and not fear. This strongly suggests to me that you know absolutely nothing about ancient paganism, what is going on, what the motivations of the people are or were. Um, and if you do know anything about it, it's probably rooted in like a very how should we say this creative, like neo-pagan propagandistic way of trying to recast paganism. The thing about pagans is they don't really enjoy their gods. Um, they don't worship their gods because they love them. Um, and it is like this is really obvious if you read any of the pagan literature, or if you study any of the pagan societies, that this is not a relationship of love. This is not um, you know yes, like you can talk about certain things like certain Bacchic rites or Dionysian festivals, and you say, oh, they're doing that out of fun or something like that. I mean, it's sort of, but there's a lot of festivals that are also like, um, I don't know, more like appeasement. Um, but like in terms of these festivals that we're talking about being something that is prayers to other gods, like I mean, you did mention that you are a Hindu. Um, there's not there's a lot of difference between Hinduism as it exists today and ancient European paganism. So I don't really know how far to take these comparisons. Um, what applies to the paganism that existed in the Central European Alps 2,000 years ago, and what you practice today as a Hindu. They're not the same. Um, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Hinduism because I'm not. That's not really an area I've studied extensively. So I'm not going to presume to speak for your religion. Um, but a lot of the sort of the things that we're talking about, like they're not fundamentally, how should I say it? They're not fundamentally religious festivals and observances, in the sense that, how should I say this? In the sense that we think of something like Christmas or Easter as modern Christians. I don't want to I don't know. Again, I don't know much about Hinduism, so I'm not going to try to say a whole lot there. Um, but these sort of things that I'm talking about with these pagan customs, again, like we don't have any clear evidence that the things people are doing in the Alps today are continuations of any actual custom, any actual festival or celebration to this or that god that was practiced 2,000 years ago. Like we basically don't know anything about what the pagans of the Alps were doing 2,000 years ago. Like almost nothing has survived to us today. We only know barely the names of a handful of gods, and those are usually like Gallo-Roman versions of those gods. Um, so you asked the question: is punishing a child for the mistakes of a parent, or is the mistakes of the parents fair? Um, I wonder if you have in mind for this the like the Reformed doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement. And I'm going to make a certain fringe group of people that only exist on the internet, but I'm not convinced exist in the real world, angry in saying this. But Orthodox Christians do not hold to that idea, the idea of penal substitution, the idea of penal substitutionary atonement, that the reason for Christ dying of the cross was to satisfy God's wrath, that Christ was being punished for our sins in that sense. That's not that's not that's not what I believe. That's not what I was taught the Orthodox Church believes. That's not what I've read in the Church Fathers. My understanding of that is that that is definitely a Calvinist teaching. That is a Protestant teaching, a relatively modern idea. And instead, what we believe is something more along the lines of how should I say this? That Christians are basically we believe that mankind more or less sold himself into slavery to sin and to demons, um and we needed rescued from that. I mean, there's a certain element of, how should I say it, of justice and of wrath and of all those things, but not in the sense of Jesus needing punished for our sins. So I don't know if that's what you're getting at. Um, Beyond that, I think it's a philosophical question that I'm not necessarily prepared to answer. Um, okay, this is actually a good question. I see where you're going with this now, Guinea Pig Man. You followed up with, so why does Exodus 25 say God is jealous and will punish third and fourth generations for the mistakes of their parents? Um, so I would say the way I understand that is that rather than this being a proscriptive discussion or a prescriptive statement that God is saying, I'm going to punish you for what your ancestors did, that rather this is a particular way in 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 the biblical literature that a fundamental reality of the world is expressed, which is that the things that I do today, especially like the really egregious and bad things that I do, and the things that we do as a culture and as a society do today, are going to have consequences that echo for generations to come. And that, like, this is a fundamental reality of the world. Now, if you continue reading Exodus 20 and with what God says immediately after this, it's also the idea that, if you repent, then I will forgive you. And so this is showing a fundamental character of the world, which is that basically you can understand it as something like, when you do evil and you are unrepentant of that evil, and then you hand your children this world that is defined by the evil that you have committed, that there's a consequence for that. There's a curse that goes along with that. Um, as Grenade Plume says, generational curses are real. Yeah, and you say it specifically says about praying to other gods. That's because praying to other gods is our participation in their rebellion. You have to understand what idolatry means in the biblical context, which is okay. Yeah, you point out this is Exodus 25. Sorry, I was thinking of a different passage in Deuteronomy when I was talking about what it says in the next verse. Um, Sorry, I know you did say Exodus 25 in your first comment. For some reason, I didn't make the connection. But yes, but I mean, it's still the same thing that we're talking about. We're talking about entering into a relationship with demons, um, of making sacrifices to demons and entering into a sort of communion with them, and that, of course, carries this same kind of consequence. And again, you will see when these ideas are reiterated later on that God does clarify you can repent of this. And if you repent of this and turn to me and turn away from your wicked ways, then you are also turning away from this curse. Again, that's the way that you have to understand that. I hope that makes sense to you. It is. I don't know. It's interesting to me to encounter this specifically in a conversation with a Hindu, because I understand that you would have a very different understanding of these things. Um, so I don't know. Sorry, there's somebody leaving stupid comments here. The type that are just an automatic boot. I don't know if anybody else has any questions, any other comments. I've been on for a little over an hour, so I'm about ready to wrap up. But Guinea Pig Man, I do appreciate your comments and your questions, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation that we've had. I know I have, and the rest of you that have tuned in, left comments, and so on. Appreciate you as well. Hopefully you got something from this. Um, um, yeah, hopefully you guys got something from this. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I'll leave just a little bit more time if anybody else has any other questions. Once again, remind everybody to check out the links in the description. Please consider becoming a channel member, supporting what we do here at the Sacred Life. You can also consider things like super chats if you enjoy our content. We especially like it if you would consider liking and subscribing to the channel, help us continue to grow. Drop a like on this video, and so on. But I'm about ready to sign off. Again, I hope you guys enjoy this. My voice is starting to wear off on me, so yeah, appreciate you guys. And yeah, once again, thanks. And until next time, wish you all peace in Christ.